have a rare moment of honesty during his speech, and I hope voters around the country are watching this.
Taxes are scheduled to go up substantially next year for everybody.
All right, that's right. I know the Anointed One will make sure that that happens.
Under the tax plan passed by the last administration, taxes are scheduled to go up substantially next year for everybody.
Google the phrase "context is everything," and you'll get hits on every subject from archaeology to zoology. Context is crucial to our understanding of events, objects, and symbols. Changing the context where we encounter these elements certainly will affect our understanding of them, and hence the meaning they carry. Artists, being the cagey thinkers that they are, often question the historical record, reconsider the utility of objects, and deconstruct cultural tradition. By changing the context of these elements, they create new relationships that challenge our views or understanding of these events, objects, and symbols. With the advent of the new era, artists were looking for new means of expression for the new context of the 20th century. But knowledge is built on knowledge. Whether it was Picasso using the primitive African art he saw in Paris in his paintings, Chagall employing a naive childlike style, or Magritte playing with the disposition of images, modern artists began questioning the nature of art. When Marcel Duchamp took everyday items and placed them in the context of an art gallery, it helped transform art from the realm of the visual to the conceptual. These ready-mades, as Duchamp called them, allowed him to emphasize that art existed in the mind and not in the object. Later, in a series of photographs by Man Ray, Duchamp recontextualizes himself as his female alter ego, Rose C'est La Vie. Is he saying that perhaps identity and gender in fact exist in the mind as well? In her photo montages, Dada artist Hannah Hock places images from the magazines of her time in juxtaposition to images of ancient artifacts. This juxtaposition calls into question the function of ritual and symbol. Both sets of images lose their original power, and the result illustrates the disconnection between modern and traditional culture. Another artist who participated in the Dada movement, Helmut Hersfeld, used photomontage to protest the rise of the Nazi Party in his homeland of Germany. He even changed his name to the anglicized John Hartfield as part of his protest. Hartfield takes on Hitler and the other Nazi leaders in his collages. As you might expect, Hartfield was forced to flee Germany in 1933 when a National Socialist came to power. Escaping to Czechoslovakia, he ultimately ended up in England. After the war, Hartfield returned to East Berlin, but because of the time he spent in England, he was seen as a collaborator by the East German police and was unable to work as an artist until 1956. Max Ernst also uses photomontage to juxtapose images. His ends are a bit different, however. The ideas of Surrealism, namely the probing of the subconscious mind to find what they thought was a more pure way of thinking and seeing, was a reaction to Europe's fixation with reason, fixation that the Surrealists believed led to the destruction of World War I. During his Surrealist phase, Ernst was using images to take the viewer beyond the scope of rational thought, where one might realize the more true and noble self that had not been corrupted by civilization. Man Ray, a contemporary of Ernst, also used altered photographs, but also included the juxtaposition of objects to create his surrealist compositions in 3 dimensions. The artists we are going to look at in the remainder of this video can be broadly categorized according to the emphasis of how they recontextualize in their art. In the 1960s and 70s, a trend in Italy to break down the divide between high and low art became known as art povera. One of the artists whose work embodied this idea was Michelangelo Pistoletto. His early work, where he painted on large mirrors, involved the viewer in the work in a way that had never happened before. He began to change the context of the traditional sculpture found in Italian museums by placing it in relationship to refuse from contemporary society, making us reevaluate what we consider to be valuable. Tony Cragg also uses the cheap, everyday material to make his sculpture. Often collecting his materials from the streets of London, he was looking for a content that revealed itself in a formal approach to the material. He has said, "There is this idea that sculpture is static, or maybe even dead. But I feel absolutely contrary to that. I'm not a religious person. I'm an absolute materialist. And for me, material is exciting and ultimately sublime. When I'm involved in making sculpture, I'm looking for a system of belief or ethics in the material. I want the material to have a dynamic, to push and to move and grow. A member of the group of artists known as pop artists, Claes Oldenburg's early work explored the nature of materials and our assumptions about them. His large-scale public works continue to address these assumptions with humor and irony. Questioning the meaning of art in a media-saturated world is the basis of the work of Jeff Koons. His early works took everyday objects and recontextualized them as art objects, similar to what Duchamp had done with his Readymades. However, while Duchamp purposely chose objects that were aesthetically neutral, Koons chose objects of desire in a consumer culture. He is often criticized because he oversees a factory of over 100 assistants that actually make most of Koons' ideas into artworks. He has even developed a color-by-number system so that his assistants can create the artworks so they look as if they were made by a single hand. In India, inexpensive metal crockery is the day-to-day tools of many people, both in the cities and in the countryside. Subhadra uses this material from his Indian heritage to make sculptures about contemporary life. The recontextualization of this material calls into question what we hold as useful, and how we have lost sight of what is valuable in our consumer culture. Like Gupta, Korean artist Jean Shin takes cast-off remnants of consumer society and transforms them into visually and conceptually engaging works. Often exploiting the use of hundreds or thousands of the same item, her sculptures take on multiple meanings by juxtaposing the original meaning of the objects used with the new form her arrangements take on. A shaman is someone who is a healer and a conduit to the spirit world. The artist as shaman was part of modern art's legacy and arose from the use of primitive images, as well as with the emphasis on individual expression. Joseph Beuys takes on this role purposefully in his life and work. Beuys feels that emotional energy leads to creativity, and that all people can be creative if they can tap into this energy. Much of his work deals with trying to access this energy. He has even developed a story about being saved from death after a plane crash by a group of Tartars, which nursed him back to health by coating his body with fat and wrapping him in felt blankets. These items become prominent in his sculptures and performances, and add to the mystical nature of his work. Philip Guston started out as a representational artist influenced by the European Surrealists, but also with an eye towards social issues in the U.S. He eventually gravitated toward a style that became prevalent in the U.S. called abstract expressionism, and became well known for his work in that genre. In the late 60s, he changed his style again, this time to a cartoony, painterly one. From 30 years earlier, the Klansmen reappear as significant imagery in these new paintings. The quintessential pop artist Andy Warhol took the popular images that appeared in American media and exploited them to the fullest. Although he claimed that there was nothing behind his work other than what you saw, over time his vision of art and the times in which he lived has coalesced. He used photos of car crashes, electric chairs, and pop culture icons taken out of context, and reimagined they become pointed statements on the obsessions of Americans during the 60s. The large-scale photographs of Wang Qing's song address the rapid urbanization of China since the Cultural Revolution. Usually made in large warehouses, his work meticulously creates aspects of contemporary Chinese society, reproducing the feeling of overpopulation, pollution, and a society searching for identity in a rapidly changing world. Wang Jin uses traditional Chinese objects and recontextualizes them with contemporary materials and images to highlight the contrast between old and new cultural norms in China. Jin uses PVC with fishing line embroidery, what he calls high-tech rubbish, to remake traditional Chinese opera costumes. He attaches American and Chinese currency to old paving stones, highlighting the shift in power from industrial production to financial institutions that create paper wealth. Wang Yan also contrasts traditional Chinese art forms with contemporary images. Often the traditional images are painted directly on the bodies of contemporary Chinese people. Since nudity is still somewhat taboo in China, this recontextualization of traditional imagery creates a tension. This tension mirrors the tension within Chinese society as it grapples with becoming a world power in a large consumer culture. Known as an early champion of feminism, Martha Rosler uses images depicting the traditional roles of women and changes the context to make us question and reevaluate the legitimacy of these images and roles. However, her work extends beyond the scope of women's issues and addresses other aspects of geopolitical concerns such as media, war, architecture, and the environment.
Apron.
Betty Saar, Kara Walker, and Carrie Mae Weems take on the issue of being African American and the historical struggle that has entailed. Using images that confront stereotypes, revisionist history, and ongoing prejudices, each of these artists keep these social issues from being co-opted by the powerful elite who would prefer this aspect of American history be distorted in their favor. Their work questions how history is constructed and how power is derived from the inclusion and exclusion of various viewpoints. Walker uses the traditional media of silhouette in her room-sized installations to point out the racist and xenophobic elements in American culture. Some of Weems' most powerful work combines text with images from early American history to highlight the crimes committed against African peoples during the time of slavery. The French artist known as J.R. began as a street artist. He first used graffiti as his means of expression. Then one day he found a camera and began documenting his tagging. Eventually he began photographing people from various neighborhoods and pasting large-scale photos of them illegally on buildings. As the potential of this method developed, J.R. began turning his works toward projects that underscored problems of social welfare and injustice. His murals sometimes literally look down on us, challenging us to confront these issues. Influence meaning by changing the context can show us new perspectives and help us question our assumptions, but we've seen how it can also create false or biased impressions. How in a media-saturated age can we guard against those who would try to control our thinking? Being aware of the crucial role that context plays in the meaning of images and symbols is imperative to avoid becoming the victim of manipulation.